Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 24. The Clearing. The Torque guards called a halt at the first fading of light, and distributed what rations were available. They were in no hurry to reach the clearing, evidently resentful for being singled out for the task of escorting the slaves, while there were so many fresh men from the north lazing about Grail. Lund was convinced that this tardiness would spare the life of the limping form behind him. As soon as the order to halt was given, the boy sagged down as if he would not rise again. His back and side was a mess of drying blood, where the wounds had opened from the long march and rough treatment. 2 slaves had been unfettered to share out the supply of stale bread and pass around the water skins. Lund made sure there was ample water for the boy, who seemed to rally his strength as he ingested the liquid. By the time the bread slave came round, he was sitting up and appeared quite alert. The bread slave halted a few steps away. Lund glanced up in annoyance, only to discover the reason for the sudden hesitation had nothing to do with fatigue or clumsiness. Staring at him in amazed delight was the familiar face of the runner Brithale. A wave of shock passed through him. He had been so convinced that his erstwhile companion had died that it was hard to believe his eyes.
"You are alive. And you."
A guard, noticing the lack of movement, flung a coarse expletive in their direction and reached for his whip. Brith was jolted back into action. As he bent over to hand them their rations, he spoke in a low whisper.
"I thought I'd never get the chance to thank you for saving me that day."
The injured boy gave a violent start at this reckless behavior, and could only stare at Lund in horror as the latter replied.
"I thought it had all been in vain."
Brith nodded almost imperceptibly as he passed on. He did not risk another remark.
"There is much I must tell you."
Lund kept his eyes lowered and on his food.
"Tomorrow, on the march."
A soft rain sifted down on them from the dawning of the second day. The rutted road soon became mired by it, to such a degree that the northbound ox carts frequently ran into difficulties, and had to be extricated by the passing slaves. Lund kept the struggling boy close to him, to allow for slack in the chain between them. Whenever slaves were needed to haul out another cart, he could step forward and partially hide the other behind him. Not being selected for such tasks provided the boy with welcome moments of rest. The frequent interruptions in the march destroyed any sense of urgency among the Torque guards. As a result, the pace was considerably slower than the first days, and the injured men took heart again. Brith worked next to him on the cart-freeing details, conversing all the time. He related his experiences during the attempted breakout, his thoughts often clumsy in the excitement of the telling. He had reached the line early on the 3rd day, and had found it impenetrable. Yet, while working his way to the north along its boundaries, he had stumbled upon what seemed to be a weak spot in the formidable defense. A brush fire had devoured miles of forest thicket some seasons before, destroying much of the thorny undergrowth and dangerous traps that made up the line. He had climbed a tall tree on the edge of the burn, and was almost certain that the scar of blackened brush reached from both sides of what appeared to be a thin divide of thorn. He had barely scrambled down in excitement when the baying of the hounds had reached his ears. His frantic efforts to escape through the barrier had been fruitless, and he had offered his captors no resistance. As the tale unfolded in his mind, Lund tried to picture the route the other had followed. If somehow the gods saw fit to let him run in the northwestern wedge again, he he would surely make use of the opportunity. All day he mused on it, till the tramping slaves had faded into the tall trees of the hunting grounds, and the smell of torque evoked nothing more than the phantom death struggle of a stricken body beneath him. The rain continued till after night fell, and they had reached the clearing. The curtains were thus drawn to familiarity, and he could not conjure a single memory of the place. The new arrivals were bundled into an empty barn, and tethered to rings set in stone. This at last breached the fog of time for most of the youths. They stared at each other in weary dejection. The painful, fearful cycles, before reaching the age of 12 and being dragged off to Grail, touched each mind afresh with recollections dark and dismal. There was no attempt at conversation, as the guards left them to eat their doled-out rations in the darkness. The first paling of the eastern sky brought a sinister surprise. Morning rations arrived in a handcart, pushed by several Vran boys, who distributed the more than ample supply quickly and silently. While, for the most part, the Grail slaves fell to with a will, several glanced about them uneasily. Warnings flickered through Lund's mind also, for the picture differed significantly and eerily with what he had come to expect. They were rebels, considered dangerous and desperate, without doubt sent to the clearing to be worked to the end of their strength. Certainly, in the light of what Kor had told him, there was little chance of seeing Grail again, since they no longer served the purpose in their master's plan. Why, then, would they be supplied with all they could eat? The Vran boys who served them were not even accompanied by a Torque overseer. Moreover, the rebels had hardly consumed the food when the tallest among them produced a key and proceeded to unchain the seated slaves. The rest moved forward, herding the rebels into groups of 5 and chaining them together, one behind the other, with the lighter, shorter lengths used for field cans. The task was completed in the compulsory silence, and with ominous efficiency. Not one slave attempted to communicate with the apparent puppets of the Torque. They simply obeyed and looked about them in suspicion. Was it some sort of test? Did the guards wish to ascertain the remaining level of resistance among the new arrivals? Or did they merely wish to demonstrate the degree of control they had over the farm-clearing slaves? When his turn came to be chained in front of 4 others, Lund looked long and hard at the slave carrying the key. Not once did the other meet his eye. A wide scar ran from the boy's left temple to his chin, twisting his mouth into a permanent grimace of pain. Other than this unintended sneer, his face was entirely expressionless. Yet he moved with energy and purpose, as one eager to please. Surely this fervor could only be born from fear. Any alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The dank, closed sunrise found them lined up in their ranks of 5 in front of a raised embankment of earth. A tall, large-eyed Torque overseer paced up and down impatiently on top of it. More than 20 keepers moved among the slaves, checking fastenings and beating them into perfectly straight lines. Once these had moved to the rear, the overseer stopped his pacing and turned to address them. He spoke in the rough language of the Torque, pausing after every other sentence to clear his throat in an annoying way. His manner reflected cold aggression, the numbing brutality of those who understood nothing but ruling by force, and who consequently could only be ruled by it themselves. Lund kept his eyes on the ground and his thoughts close. The madmen in front of them would maim or kill without hesitation.
I know you understand what I say. You are the schemers, the cunning rebels of Grail.
He stared at them in disgust.
You have forgotten the lessons you were taught here in the clearings. You dared to think, to speak, to plan, and now you see the results of it.
Flooding back to Lund now came the memory of mindless fear that was the clearing, the reason of the young overthrown till they were cowering shadows with no instinct but survival. He saw again the trembling form of Brennick in the pits, the wide-eyed courage it took merely to utter a whisper.
They did well in Grail to return you to me. They did not do well to let you become wild and forgetful. But I am the tamer of the desert lion, and I will tame you once more before I let you die.
Dark clouds were crowding in from the west, driven by a sudden squall of warm wind. Soon the large drops would fall, and the lightning streak across the sky. None of the slaves moved or gave the slightest sign of understanding at this last statement. They were well versed in sullen, resentful silence, for it was their only defense. The threat of death meant little to them who were condemned virtually from birth, but the promise to have their will broken and the memory of what means might be employed to achieve that left them in dread most dire. Soon the weakening hunger, the routine brutality, the exhausting labor, the mockery and degradation, the constant dashing of hope, the ceaseless pain would have them dancing to the master's tune, all thought of resistance or disobedience banished to dark corners of a frozen mind. They merely stood with bowed heads, the small hope brought by a full stomach torn from them so quickly. And how scornful they were of it now, compared to the misery that was their failure at Grail. Those who had dared to hope and let their anger hatch deeds of vengeance would face the long pain before escaping into death. Suddenly, the severely wounded, the weakest among them, became objects of envy. None of these feelings found expression, however, in the miserable body of slaves. They moved off with the same lifeless shuffle that marked their existence elsewhere, and bore the needless lashing of the guards without flinching or showing resentment. Many were too tired of anger to hold on to it, rather retreating into the dull, closed mind of the hopelessly oppressed. Lund struggled bitterly with his own fury. He knew the reason for which they had been sent to the clearing, and was prepared to face it on his own, but the thought of the wounded boy, now chained behind someone else, as well as the willing but barely capable Brithael, exposed to the full malice of the Torque, was hard to bear. It was foolish, he knew, for they had never been in hope of survival. He was the one who had extended a hand, attempting to save the unsavable. As it happened, he soon learned that the thoughts of pity he spared for others should rather have been spared for himself. The leading slaves of 2 lines of 5 were chained together to form a gang of 10. 10 slaves of varying size and strength would drag the heavy 4-share iron plows used throughout the farm clearings till they dropped from exhaustion or the ministrations of the whip. Harnessed in the lead, Lund had little difficulty keeping a steady pace for his gang. He knew not to lag behind other teams and thus invite a flurry of angry whooping, or to wear out the slaves by pulling too energetically. His healing ribs troubled him at first, but he soon set the harness to shift the strain of pulling to his hips. There was nothing amiss with his legs, and being a runner they were his greatest strength. The slaves were not being starved as yet, so the plowing had to be completed quickly. Evidently, the master in the clearing had not received instruction of the closing down of operations, or the annihilation of the slaves would not take place as soon as Gore had anticipated. If there would be another harvest, the fields needed preparing and tilling before the rainy season ended. During the midday rest period, clearing slaves brought them water and an ample supply of tull. The bulbous root of the tull plant, with its thin yellow-brown skin, was grown almost throughout the cycle, and formed the basis of the slaves' diet for many seasons. Washed and boiled without peeling, a large root made a nutritious meal. Chained together in their gangs, the field slaves remained seated next to their plows, while the others, one to a group, brought water skins and large wooden bowls of tow. Each slave would drink in turn and receive his rations from the bowl. Lund noticed that the serving slaves soon settled into a pattern, the same one serving a specific gang. Theirs was a particularly dirty boy of perhaps 16 cycles, wearing an equally dirty cloth cap. In sharp contrast to the Vran boy who chained them into gangs every morning, this one's eyes showed life and keen interest. On several occasions, Lund caught the fellow cautiously stealing glances at him, and when his turn came to reach into the bowl, there was something akin to excitement in the other's manner. They had not been in the field 5 days when Lund's gang was singled out for brutality. It was clear from the start that this action had much to do with his presence in it. Keepers had been pointing and whispering since his arrival. They had to have identified him as the slayer of their kind. At first, he had hoped to remain the subject of their curses and near-black looks, that the charm which had kept him alive in Grail and spared him on several occasions in the trails would somehow reach to the clearing as well. Yet he was soon convinced that his importance as a sacrifice had no significance to these keepers. Besides, there were presently many slaves in the clearings that had spilled Torque blood. It was only the notorious way in which he had done it that would make him the prime target for vengeance. There was little enough initially to indicate that malicious intent had focused on him. He was even slightly amused at the expression of confusion and dismay on the face of their food slave when only his gang was ordered to continue work throughout the rest period. The boy waited till all 5 other gangs had resumed their plowing, gave them one last worried look, and returned their rations to the handcart. Instead of being satisfied with their seemingly wanton act of cruelty, the guards appeared inspired by it. The afternoon passed in a blur of fatigue and pain. All 5 guards gathered round the one plow, taking turns at lashing the gang in a brutal and unrelenting way. This was not how one would drive a team of oxen. It was the damaging beating of retribution. No matter how fast they dragged the plow, there was no slackening of the lashing, even when the guards began to fall behind. The other gangs worked on unmolested and showed no signs of slowing. Fear of bearing the brunt of the guards' brutality in their turn kept the rest of the slaves in line. Once they tired of chasing the slaves across the field, the guards would wait near the middle till the plow had made its turn at the far end and passed by them again. This gave the gasping slaves a few moments without the lash, and they would slow the pace considerably. Only once they had turned did they appear to rush on with all haste. Now, however, all the guards would strike at them in passing, drawing blood from their cramping limbs and sometimes nearly bringing them to a standstill. By the time the dawdling sun touched the western trees, the 10 slaves were crawling on all 4s in front of their plow like animals. The following day they fared little better. Lund's gang was left to itself during the morning session, and was even allowed to halt and take the midday meal. The guard sauntered over to them, however, and with a rolled whip in hand, touched the food slave on his arm when he was about to offer Lund the waterskin. The guard motioned further down the line, though. There was no objection to the others receiving their ration. Lund gave no sign of dejection or outrage. He kept his eyes on the ground. The guard lazily turned his back and strode off to find his own meal. It was clear to Lund what they intended. They wanted him to be the first slave to drop that afternoon, the first to be humiliated. His tongue felt swollen in his mouth, and his limbs ached from the labor. With every shred of resolve inside him, he purposed not to give them that satisfaction. The boy had passed to the end of the line, and should have turned away to the cart with Lund's rations still in the bowl. Instead, he strolled back halfway up the line, and shoved the bowl under the nose of the slave seated there. There was an urgent whisper and a slight nod in his direction. At once he realized what the boy was doing. It was a brash and foolish act, but he was warmed and encouraged by it nonetheless. It seemed he would still receive his meal, one way or another. On impulse, he reached for his benefactor's mind.
You risk much.
The boy gave a start and nearly dropped the bowl. Their eyes met briefly. Something strange tugged at Lund's mind, augmented many times when the boy replied.
Not if this dullard in front of me would act quickly.
The dullard in question, as if in response, grabbed the proffered toll and hid it behind his back. The boy promptly turned away and started out across the field. Lund stared at the unhurried form.
What is your name?
There was no change of pace.
Sarah,
A brief message of gratitude had hardly passed through his thoughts when he felt the nudge of the slave next to him, and the heavy, moist toll was pressed into his hand. Instantly, he brought up his knees and placed his arms on top of them. He lowered his head, as if in fatigue, to press the cool pulp of the vegetable into his mouth. Even as he relished the moistness of it, he wondered again at the unusual aspect of the boy's thoughts. They were unlike any he had felt before. It was amazing how this little act of defiance sustained him during the nightmare of that afternoon. It took a mere 3 turns of the plow for the first slave to collapse, and have the blows rain on him till he had staggered to his feet again. Lund waited for 2 more to drop before he purposely stumbled and fell. The guards would expect some sign of weakness, and he had little choice but to play their game. He took care to shelter his face with his arms, and brought up his legs so that the worst of the blows fell on his back. The many folds of cloth protected him from most of it. Spreading the dirt of the field over his face and neck, he followed Sered's example in appearing beaten and despondent. Throughout the remainder of the afternoon, he stumbled about, hanging his head as if on the verge of collapse. He was certain that fewer blows were aimed at him than previously. Every slave in his gang suspected by now that their special treatment had something to do with his presence. Had they been dull and slow of mind, there would have been growing resentment and even hatred, but these slaves had abandoned their hope for survival after Grail. Whether they were driven to death that day or the one after mattered little to them. In fact, being broken so soon might be a merciful ending. Also, there was not one among them who did not believe that he had earned such treatment as his due. Day followed terrible day, with the guards thinking up new tortures for the rebels from Grail. Morning rations diminished in quality and volume, while the heavy labor stretched from dawn till dusk. The slaves were constantly exhausted, and thought of little else than their next meal and the peaceful dark of the shed at night. Daylight hours congealed into a slow and deliberate torture of mind and body, interrupted only by the brief rest at midday. Soon, even the strongest among them dragged their feet through the dirt with stooped shoulders and hanging heads. Lund kept up the uneven contest as best he could. His gang no longer had the strength to drag the plow at the required crazy pace, and though it exposed them to the brutality of their drivers more often, it also allowed him to preserve what endurance remained in his weakening frame. The risky passing of food at midday ceased abruptly when a slave was spotted and savagely beaten for aiding him. The sustenance and essential moisture he sorely needed was thus once more beyond his reach. It would have been unavoidable, the steady attrition of mind and body, the final collapse into a state of animal fear and thoughtless obedience, had it not been for the unexpected intervention of a faction among the clearing slaves. For the most part, these last seemed thoroughly under the heel of the overseer. The boys who had led them out that first morning had not displayed any pity for these condemned rebels. Neither had they shown the least inclination to act outside their given instructions. In every way they were the puppets of the guards, even if they performed their tasks listlessly and without enthusiasm. Only the boy who had aided Lund in the field demonstrated the same defiance most every slave in Grail had owned. It soon became apparent that many others in the clearing shared this sentiment. Lund woke to a not-so-gentle touch on his shoulder. Even as he shook off the grogginess of sleep, he became aware that it was still almost completely dark in the windowless shed. His weary mind told him that the night could not be half spent. Were they to be deprived of rest as well? Why had the boys brought no lanterns with them? Soon he realized that it was too quiet for an intrusion by the guards. He straightened up. Around him the other slaves were still breathing deeply in dreamless sleep. He stared about him in confusion. A familiar thought touched him like a warm breath.
You are awake at last.
A figure crouched next to him in the dark. He could recognize the outlines of the cloth cap. It was their food slave.
Sarid, what are you doing here?
Something was thrust into his hands. He felt the soft rounding of fruit, the heaviness of cooked tull.
Eat.
Strange as it was to receive this unexpected nocturnal visitor, Lund needed no second invitation to wolf down the food he had brought. The boy placed a full water skin at his side and sat down as if to watch him. An odd conversation flowed back and forth.
Your name is Lund.
Yes?
I knew it from the start. I have a message for you from Lathan. He is our listener, even if he is old. He says not to lose heart, that we will aid you in what ways we can. Do not let the torque kill you in the fields.
Lund shrugged to himself.
There is nothing to be done. They will work us till we die.
The rate at which you are plowing, it will not last another 10 days. You only have to hold out till then. Tilling is much easier work, and I can always get you food.
Lund nodded.
Thank you. But what about the others?
You care about them?
Of course. They are our people. Can you bring food for them too?
There was a moment of silence. Lund felt strongly that his latest statements had been evaluated and approved of. Then followed a partisan reply, at once childish and warming.
They are not deprived of the midday meal like you are. They should be fine without my help.
Lund refrained from asking why he had become the object of such brave assistance, and from pointing out that the other slaves were not treated to sweet fruit or extra water rations. He merely leaned back to ingest as much of the liquid as his stomach would hold, after which he wet his hands and drew them across his face with a sigh. The boy rose to leave. Lund handed him the half-empty water skin.
I will try my best to stay alive.
Yes, you must.
Before he slipped back into sleep, Lund pondered over the unexpected development. How easily hope was restored. A handful of fruit and a message of encouragement could bring one's spirit from the blackest pit of despair. And yet there was something odd about the messenger, who seemed younger than his size suggested, and much less rugged than he had expected to find among the older boys in the clearing. A strong suspicion took hold of him, and the longer he reflected on it, the more certain he became. Sarid came every night, bringing a variety of stolen fruit in addition to the standard fare. Lund saved a portion each time for the wounded boy whose name he still did not know. The latter, mercifully, was not in his field gang, but seemed close to total collapse every time Lund laid eyes on him. Perchance, the little aid provided would encourage him to last till the plowing was done. Finally, nearly 20 days since their arrival in the clearing, the Grail field gangs were separated and reassigned to other tasks. Every inch of open land had been plowed. Now overseers from different parts of the clearing arrived to select slaves to join their teams. About half remained in the original shed, destined to spread dung on the plowed fields. Several went off to the slaughtering pits and tanning sheds. A dozen stronger slaves, birth among them, disappeared altogether. It was rumored that they had been moved to the mysterious eastern part of the forest, many miles distant, where tall mountains rose above the trees to break iron from the dark rock. Lund, who had been assigned to the harvesting of cotton, was sad to see his friend go. Ruth had been a strong potential ally, even though he would have held him back in an attempted escape. The clearing would be all the more dismal without him. Picking cotton was almost like working between trail runs back in Grail, only better. Gone were the vicious guards and the whipping, the deprivation of rest or food during the midday break, and the chains linking him to 9 other slaves. As long as the heavy baskets were filled by day's end, there was little interference with the picker's movements or rest periods. Lund could sprawl in the shade by himself, awaiting the arrival of the food slave. It surprised him only a little to see Serid trudging up the narrow defile between the rows of tall cotton. He wore a reproachful look, stomping through the muddy patches till he saw Lund rising up to meet him. The food and water skin were shoved into his hands rather roughly, and for the first time he heard the boy's voice. It confirmed all his suspicions.
You are supposed to come down to the crossing for the midday break. There you fetch your food and eat it where you please.
I did not know that. I will remember.
He sat down again and fell to hungrily.
You do not serve the field slaves anymore.
Only half of them remain. I asked to come up here, and nobody minds because the cotton trees are the furthest from the hearth.
Lund drank long and deep from the skin. Instead of returning to the food cart, Serid sat down next to him, apparently eager for conversation. While the other ate, he explained that fetching food for the pickers was his last duty of the day, since he woke well before the dawn to help prepare the morning meals. Thus, there was no hurry to return the cart before the even meal. He pointed to Lund's picking bag, half filled with cotton.
You have picked cotton before?
When I was very small, I hardly remember it.
I will show you how to do it quickly, and without pricking your fingers all the time.
Serid picked a ball from an overhanging branch, deftly removing the cotton lint from it with nimble fingers. He opened the bag to stuff it in. Lund suddenly grabbed hold of his hand, spreading out the fingers.
You are a girl.
There was no question in his tone, merely a statement of fact. Serid pulled away the hand and gave him a startled look.
How did you know?
Your fingers, your walk, your voice, but mostly the way you speak in my mind.
There was no immediate reply, but only an amusing inspection of the giveaway fingers. She wet her hands from the skin and rubbed away the dirt from her face, then pulled the cloth cap from her head. Pale yellow hair, the same shade as his, fell down her back.
But for that, the speaking, you would not know?
He stared at her, shaking his head.
I believe not.
She gained a little color under his gaze.
What is your name?
Seridwin.
We are related, Seridwin, or you would not hear my thoughts.
He waited a moment to consider this.
You may be my sister.
Half-sister at best. You are not much older than I.
How many cycles do you have?
17. 18 in the beginning of planting.
Yes, I see. I was born just after the darkening, 18 cycles ago. I have barely half a cycle on you.
He straightened up.
I have to start picking again if I hope to escape a beating tonight.
She jumped up, bundling her hair back under the cap.
I will help you, if you like.
With an extra pair of skilled hands, Lund finished his task long before the slaves were summoned at the end of day. Seridwin kept up a lively exchange throughout the afternoon, informing him of all the activities in the clearing, and rating them in terms of undesirability. The worst was the plowing, followed closely by harvesting wheat or barley. Digging out the tull could also be terrible, depending on which overseer was in charge. Cotton picking, though tedious and often painful, was not too bad, mainly because of the laziness of the guards, who were supposed to check on the slaves regularly. Lund was in luck too, for there was a severe shortage of pickers just then, and he could remain there for several 10 days. As they filled the basket from their bag, she paused momentarily and asked,
Aren't you going to ask me why I'm hiding among the boys?
He shrugged.
Well?
She looked down at her hands, which despite her claims of earlier had been pricked in several places. She pressed her fingers together absently and wiped the blood away on her dirty tunic.
There are 4,000 slaves here, just working the fields. More than half of them have 14 cycles or fewer. Some 900 are female, all younger than 12.
She lifted her gaze to meet his.
Almost all the girls, sooner or later are dragged off to serve in the pits.
Her eyes blazed.
I will not be bred to a man like an animal. I will rather die.
Then how did you...
They shaved our hair, the whole hut, when I was 8, for the lice. They mistook me for a boy after, and I did my best to keep it that way.
You know they will find out before long.
Not before I get away.
Every day, Ceridwen would bring his food to where he waited among the tall cotton. She would help him with the picking after they had shared the midday meal in the shade. Always she would talk of her duties, her plans, her small defiance. Lund felt sorry for her, even as he admired her bravery and spirit. Having made several unsuccessful attempts at escaping the clutches of the Torque, he knew how futile her hopes were. Yet he never spoke a discouraging word, for fear of destroying this fragile glow that somehow managed to warm him too. She was looking for an ally, he realized, someone with strength enough to bring her wild dreams within her reach at last. Always a question or two slipped in that made it clear that she was well aware of who he was. 6 days into cotton picking, they were seated close to the full basket, awaiting the end of day call. Already, the strain of the first 10 days in the clearing was leaving Lund's body. He was relaxed, almost content. The girl sat close by, playing with a ball of cotton. Her voice came from seemingly far away.
Is it true that you killed a hunter?
Lund looked up sharply. The expectant awe in the other's eyes made him grimace.
Yes, it's true.
Ceridwen slowly shook her head.
Your name is known throughout the farm clearings.
He snorted in disgust.
I'll tell you what you don't know.
He hesitated at her apprehensive expression, but continued nonetheless.
It was far more foolish than heroic. I should have been killed several times. I do not know why I'm still alive. If it had not been for Kor, and many others besides.
He shuddered at the crowding dark memories.
Defying them like that is utterly futile.
They hate you.
Her voice was pensive, sympathetic.
I've heard them. They will kill us all in the end, I suppose. But you, they want to live and suffer.
She dropped the cotton into the basket.
So, you see, you have to get away, or continue to be tormented.
And where is this away?
She shrugged as if this was an irrelevant question.
Oh, up the northern road, beyond the forest, to where nobody would know who you are.
And you?
Me?
She smiled at him.
I will come with you.
By the first 10th day, Lund no longer felt the slightest pain when he pressed his fingers where the bruises had been over his ribs. He could twist his body in any direction without the sudden debilitating stab that had been the result of such rash actions since his last hunt. His strength had returned, thanks to the additional food, the less than strenuous labor, and most of all, the pleasant and heartening company of the unusual girl, Ceridwen. She was a mine of information, and showed insight beyond her cycles. It intrigued him how she had learned what transpired in the other clearings, or even the further reaches of the one in which she had spent her entire life. One day she merely sat with him, lost in thought, scratching in the dirt with a twig. He watched as patterns emerged, lines of neatly etched symbols. At once his curiosity was aroused.
What are you drawing there, in the sand?
These are not drawings. It is the writing of our language.
Who taught you this?
The old men, before they are sent to the feeding pits.
There are no such in Grail. I was taken there when I had 12 cycles, to fetch and carry and start the training. I have never seen writing.
Did you not mention an old one protecting you?
Kor is a protector, not a teacher, and he's beyond old. No one has seen him for many cycles. I have no idea where to find him.
We have no protectors in the clearing. Many boys, the stronger ones, go to Grail to kill each other or be hunted. Those who remain and grow into men are taken to eastern mountains where they die in the mines.
How is it you know so much?
When one plans to defy the mighty masters, it is prudent to learn all one can.
The old men?
The old men.
Lund was suddenly excited.
Would you teach me what you know?
Their talking needed not be limited to fruitless intrigue. His terrible thirst for knowledge might be slaked, even if it would be only for a while. They started that very afternoon, amid fits of laughter from Ceridwen, to write in the sand among the cotton trees. At some stage, he could no longer bear it. He rose up halfway through the drawing to frown at her. She folded her arms. Her voice was light-hearted, and still full of the laughter of a moment before.
Why do you stare so?
You laugh.
She narrowed her eyes at him mockingly under a heavy frown.
There is something wrong with laughing?
No.
Lund was more than a little confused. He remembered only the painful grimace shared among the slaves at some good fortune, or the mocking leer of the overseer or hunter when their victims lay helpless in their grip. This laughter was altogether different, an expression of unexplored emotions.
You laugh as though it may be enjoyable.
His mouth distorted into a half-smile.
I have never seen this.
She stood for a moment or two, thinking hard.
I can't help it. I want to laugh. There's a lot of laughter in me, and so little to laugh about.
There was even less to laugh about when the following 10th day came round. The cotton trees had been stripped bare, and the pickers were moved to other sheds calling for fresh workers. Lund would lose his leisurely afternoons, filled with the light of learning and companionship. All this was to be traded for the dark misery of the tanning sheds. The clearing boasted sizable herds of cattle and goats. Hunters brought in carcasses of forest deer on a daily basis. A large shed, close to the edge of the trees, was used for the processing and curing of meat, while another 3 were designated the working space for the tanners. The slaughter shed was situated on the banks of a fairly large stream, which formed the western boundary of the compound. An identical building sprawled to the east of it, with only a narrow passage between. This was a store, for the casks filled to the brim with salted, smoked cuts of beef, goat, or pork, to be carted away periodically to the unknown regions north of Grail. The tanning yard lay to the south of these structures, bordered in the north by the first 2 sheds, directly adjacent to the slaughtering sheds, in the west by the stream and the 3rd tanning shed, and in the far south by an open timber store. The yard itself contained an ox-driven stone mill for grinding stripped bark, 3 half casks, each with its fireplace, for leaching the tanning liquor, and 2 large filtering barrels for extracting lye from ashes. Each of these 3 stations employed an overseer, a guard, and 4 slaves. Weathered timber lean-tos kept the rain from interfering with any of the work in the yard, while allowing sun and wind to speed the drying of the bark and disperse the smoke from fires. On a still day, the pungent smell of the soaking hides was noticeable miles away. It was an all too potent reminder for the slaves assigned here that their particular horror reached beyond the daily task and would not allow them escape. Yet Lund had escaped it, traded it for the uncertainties of the running trails. It had been here, as a boy of 12 cycles, that he had been pulled from the never-ending dance in the rinsing vats by an overseer. He had been relieved at first, if apprehensive, not understanding what it meant to be a runner. It had seemed a miracle to be free from the endless trampling of lye-soaked hides, the routine striping of his back, the constant fatigue. How little he had known back then. As Lund approached the scene of his boyhood suffering again that first morning, a deep, familiar dread hung over the tanning yard and sheds. 9 other cotton pickers had been sent here with him. The tanning yard seemed to have a perpetual shortage of slaves. Though there was enough work here to occupy more than 100 slaves, with 20 more used for tree felling, logging, and stripping bark, Lund wondered why there was a constant need for replacements. Were the slaves here ever reassigned to other tasks? Surely there was only one season for selecting unfortunates to send to Grail. He was soon to discover the real reason. The older, stronger slaves served in the first shed, where they bent their backs over the fleshing beams. These last were stout logs, with one end raised to just below waist height, over which the fresh hides were draped. The slave methodically removed all the flesh, fat, and membrane from the underside of the hide with a dull metal scraper, taking care not to damage the skin itself. It was tedious work and taxing. When Lund took his newly appointed place at the first of the 8 beams, he could barely suppress a sigh of dejection. The days in the tanning shed would be long and merciless. The sides of the sheds were covered with woven mats rather than boards, in order to allow for the passage of air during the stifling days of the wet season. The mats were rolled up and fastened to the posts supporting the roof every morning before work commenced. From the back of the first shed, where the fleshing beams were located, Lund could thus view the entire yard, as well as the interior of the adjacent third shed, which was similarly equipped with rolling mats. Only the large soaking and storage shed to his left wore heavy planks on its sides, preventing a casual inspection of its contents. Yet he knew what it contained: row upon row of stacked barrels, soaking hides sealed on the inside, in front of which the soakers stirred the fleshed and rinsed hides from his shed in their first bath of tanning liquor with large wooden paddles. These low soaking vats were the principal source of the somewhat sour odor pervading the place. The tanning shed was smaller than he remembered, no doubt because it had been so intimidating and fear-inspiring when he was but a boy. Directly in front of him stood 4 tall lye casks, where the fleshed hides would be soaked before moving to the third shed. These slaves, perhaps, had the easiest task of all, fetching water and lye to prepare an empty cask, placing fresh hides in it, and keeping track of the length of soaking in a particular cask. 3 days were sufficient to loosen the hair and send the dripping hides to the de-hairing beams in the third shed. This was similar to fleshing, but required much less effort since the hides had been soaked. The third shed, however, also contained the dreadful rinsing vats, where 8 boys endlessly trod the lye-soaked skins in clean water before they could be sent to the tanning vats. Thigh-deep in slimy water, these unfortunates toiled without respite, often becoming so fatigued that they could hardly drag their bodies to the hearth in the evening. It was a mark of calculated cruelty that they were not relieved by others, and a source of amusement to the heartless overseer and his guards to strike at them when they slowed down or rested a hand on the waist-high rim of the vat. The very sight of it sickened Lund, for he knew this gruesome dance all too well. Still, he certainly owed a large portion of his endurance to this harsh treatment. If it had not been for the rinsing vats, he would hardly have been chosen as a runner, and allowed an opportunity, however small, of escaping this cursed realm. Weary hours passed. Lund paced himself carefully, feeling the strain of muscles in his back, determined not to wear himself out, or invite the unwelcome attentions of the lash. The fleshing overseer, a smallish, dark Torque, seemed satisfied with the skill and swiftness of his new workers, for he kept an eye on them from a distance, and did not break the rhythm of their work by lashing them out of custom. The whistle and fall of the lash echoed regularly only in the third shed. Ere long, there were exclamations of pain and coarse laughter to accompany the grisly tune. Lund kept his eyes averted now, the familiar hatred burning inside. The fleshing tool became light in his hands, almost eager, as if it had a taste for more than the dead flesh on the hide beneath him. There was a brief respite when the food slaves arrived. Ceridwen had mysteriously succeeded in persuading her way into the tanning yard detail. It was a relief to see her among the others, pushing a laden handcart among the yard slaves as if she had done it for seasons on end. He was amazed at how her mere presence rekindled hope inside him. When their eyes met briefly, and she inclined her head for him to follow discreetly, he surely felt a touch of what produced the reckless smile he so envied her. In the dark, among the sealed barrels at the back of the tanning shed, they could trade a few words without discovery and punishment. Lund ate hastily, listening to the gossip and well-meant advice of his companion.
It is bad that they've placed you here. It is certainly the worst of all the yards in the clearing.
The worst?
The most dangerous. Do you not wonder why there is a demand for slaves here all the time? It is not because they are worn out with the labor and the work. Moshta, he oversees the rinsing vats. He is a demon, with a strong taste for flesh.
Lund gave a start. He did not need to ask what kind of flesh.
They do not complain that he depletes the numbers?
Why would they? As long as there's a steady supply coming in. And now there are many new slaves from Grail.
She handed him the water skin.
Just keep your eyes on the ground and look utterly miserable. Then they like you. And do not work in the rinsing shed.
Lund grimaced in the darkness. It was not that he could choose where to labor for the Torque Masters. It so happened that he was no longer of the customary age to be shoved into the shallow vats to tread out the hides. Yet, if the overseer ran out of replacements... Sensing his brooding, Ceridwen changed the subject. The old man, Lathan, knew when shipments were to be sent north, and had devised a plan to smuggle the slave to the outside at the next opportunity. The barrels against which they were leaning were sealed and heavy with hides. For the most part, these would soak for half a cycle before they were opened in the faraway north. If a slave were to be sealed inside, would that not assure a safe passage out of the clearing? When the barrels reached their destination, he could simply slip out once they had been stored in some shed. Lund listened with growing excitement. The plan was risky and fraught with danger, but there seemed to be a possibility of success. Mayhap he was desperate enough to try anything, but before he had even heard all the details, his heart had quickened its beat.
Who will be selected to go?
Nathan believes it should be an older person, one with enough wisdom not to be caught as soon as he escapes from the barrel. He even said that more than one should go, in different barrels. Thus we double the chance of success.
Shouts from the guards outside, accompanied by the loud cracking of whips, indicated that the midday break had ended. Ceridwen gathered up the water skin in haste. Lund gripped her arm.
When?
A season, maybe more.
She was gone in a furtive rush. For days to come, they speculated on who would be selected to go. Lund found that he could think of little else. The more he saw of Moshta's dealings in the rinsing shed, the more he longed to find a way of escape for the hopeless victims. It was difficult to have such strong hope and witness the sad despondency on the faces of others. Often they would speak of the legends concerning the world outside the forest. Huge clearings of rolling grass that stretched for miles without end. Lakes of deep water reaching further than the eye could see. What wonders the world contained. Lund would lean against the sturdy promise of a barrel behind him, resting his weary back, his mind awash with dreams. Only once did he confide in her.
There is something I long to see above all else.
His voice was far away, as if his fantasy had become tangible.
The cold places where rain falls from the sky in frozen flakes.
Ceridwen only partially succeeded in suppressing her laughter.
There are such places.
He watched her in the semi-dark, grimly fascinated by her almost cheerful smile, the life in her eyes. The more he watched her, the more he decided that she was not going to die, not as a slave. When next he spoke, her laughter had spilled over into him.
Why is it that I enjoy talking so much, even in whispers?
There was only a slight hesitation before her answer.
Because it is forbidden?
10 day followed 10 day with no word from Lathan. The casks of cured meat flowed in a steady stream from the slaughtering sheds, but no barrels were taken from the tanning yard to accompany them. Lund was in a black mood, riling to himself that the only slaves traveling north in a barrel would be those sliced into servings and cured with salt. Certainly, the hunger for human flesh was not limited to the overseer Moshta and the more perverse of his cronies. There were many favors to be bought by the odd cask of exotic meat delivered to Grail. Lund kept a careful eye on the slaves in the rinsing vats. He was quite sure that at least 2 new faces appeared every 10 day. The missing ones were not merely rotated either, for though the stations like Fleshing that required older slaves were never disturbed, it soon appeared that the lean-tos in the yard were being stripped of any extra hands there. Moshta was a large, muscular fellow, walking with a swagger. He wore a half-smile whenever he moved among the slaves, and his bulging eyes were bright with malice. Nothing escaped his attention. He never missed an opportunity to inflict pain. Though all the slaves in the yard feared him, the boys in the rinsing vats were stricken with mortal terror whenever they saw him approach. Their overseer never merely checked on his workers. He kept them laboring with sharp cruelty. Lund could sense the evil of this man across the 2 sheds, could feel the spite of his sharp-toothed smile wash through the yard like a poison. Undoubtedly, the others could feel it too, for Moshta would crack his long lash only once at the far end of the 3rd shed, for all the slaves in the tanning yard to lower their heads in utter dejection. Even some of the overseers recoiled from him. The somewhat docile Torque in charge of Fleshing would stride over to slaughtering each time he saw the offensive bulk strolling into his shed. Yet there were others who fawned about him, eager to laugh at his jests and cruelties. Several among them had the baleful look and sharpened teeth of flesh-eaters. All carried the cowardly air of carrion animals. As his toil at the fleshing beam entered the 4th 10 day, Lund noticed another rotation of slaves. 2 adults were moved to leeching in the yard, while the boys they replaced stripped down to breech clouts and clambered into the rinsing vats. This left the 2 deherring beams where the former had worked in the 3rd shed vacant. Not long after, Lund's overseer, wearing a deep frown, motioned for him to stop work. He had been selected to take up one of the vacant beams. Though it was much easier work, Lund did not appreciate the move. He would be so much closer to the brutality now, would be within reach of the dreadful Moshta all hours of the day. His new overseer proved little better. The slaves at his station were whipped for the slightest blemish on their hides, and often simply for not appearing vigorous and lively enough for the brute's taste. Lund soon caught himself wishing to be moved out to the yard, despite the terrible cost that would accompany such release. As the days wore on, tension mounted in the 3rd shed. Soon 2 more victims would be selected and disappear from the rinsing vats. No one was tardy or made the slightest mistake. The boys were red-faced and sweating despite the cold water. None thought to touch the side of a vat. They knew, thought Lund, that they could not escape. Now they felt something of the hopeless fear of a runner, and still there was hope that it would pass them by, that they would not be selected. Such hope made the strain unbearable. Moshta enjoyed the situation immensely. As the 10th day came round, he was in the highest of spirits, shouting and cracking his whip unnecessarily whenever things grew too quiet for his liking. His skill with the lash was legendary, a favorite trick of his being to pierce the ear of a slave before the head could be jerked away. This he practiced on 3 unfortunates throughout the day, causing the rest to recoil in horror whenever he came near. The day drew to a close. One by one the stations halted their work, as the overseer present signaled to his slaves to complete the task in hand and gather in the yard. The boys were ordered out of the vats. 2 were chosen to drain the water and drag out the rinsed hides. The rest, without a backward glance, scurried towards the safety of the yard. Lund and 1 other walked round the outer walls of the shed, releasing the ties holding up the mats. By the time the last hide had been draped over a drying frame, only 2 mats remained. Moshta motioned the 2 of them out with a slight inclination of his head. His face had already settled in the mask of death. Neither the overseer nor the boys who had remained with him showed up in the 3rd shed the next day. The whispered rumor ran through the yard that the brute had finally bought the promotion he so desired. When there was no sign of him the day after, Lund fervently hoped that some such miracle had rid them of his vile presence. The boys, treading hides in the vats, still too short, seemed a little lost, as if they were unable to comprehend that such good fortune could have overtaken them. The guards, too, seemed ill at ease, their malice lacking in direction. Lund found the waiting for Lathan almost bearable again. Perchance they would reach the next 10 day without the disappearance. 6 days passed before a red-faced Moshta made his customary loud entrance during the midday break. He was in a foul mood, to such a degree that he ignored the slaves completely, all but a food slave whom he cuffed for offering him the required provisions. Overseers and guards alike kept their distance. Even his favorites dared not make inquiries as to what had brought him back to tanning. As soon as work was resumed, he picked 2 more boys from bark crushing for the vats without bothering to replace them. There were foul looks from other overseers, but none would interfere. Lund watched these latest victims climb into the vats with a sinking heart. There was a sudden sharp intake of breath, as the slower of the 2 had his fingers broken by Moshta's whip handle for resting them too long on the forbidden vat edge. Things were back to normal. The new boys were slow in adjusting to their role, or perhaps just unlucky. Cuffs and kicks seemed to find them with greater regularity than the older hands, who shamefully appreciated this minor reprieve. Apprehension peaked once more at the dawning of the 10th day. Lund started work with one eye fastened on the rinsing vats. The tension made him clumsy, till he was sure to invite the ministrations of the lash ere long. Moshta's slaves were lugging large buckets of water from the stream for the first rinse. The new boys seemed as tense and awkward as ever. One had the misfortune of slipping on the lye-soaked stone and spilling the bucket of water over the sandaled feet of a guard. The boy struggled to rise, and was on hands and knees when the guard brought a foot down on his shoulder and pressed his face down on the wet stone. Here the slave remained, quivering like a kicked dog, while Moshta strutted over to him with deliberate tardiness. He struck the boy a single blow with his whip, which brought every head in the sheds up in shock, and dragged a ringing squeal of pain from the cowering form. There was a burst of laughter at this, and even more as the guard sent him sprawling with his foot. Lund felt his hands tightening on the metal scraper, but he did not break his rhythm. A name was promoted to the first place on his long list of retribution. He would make the burly Torque run a mile before choking the life out of him. He could barely shake the heaviness when Ceridwen arrived at midday. How strange it was, then, that she would bring the long-awaited news that very afternoon. Tanning casks would be moved north in 2 days' time, and Lund would be in one of them if he so desired. He had little doubt that this was largely owed to Ceridwen's laboring on his behalf. The old man had to hold her in high regard. He had gripped her hands fiercely at the first hearing of the news, but felt little enthusiasm in response. She would not accompany him then, would lose her companion and potential champion. The days would grow long and empty again, while for many a 10-day she would have to guess at the outcome of this desperate scheme. And if it turned out unsuccessful? Still, there were many plans to discuss. The time of the sealing was arranged for the night before the shipment. Food and water sufficient for 4 10 days would be smuggled in. A half-hearted breakout would be attempted that same night to explain the missing slaves. As the midday break drew to a close, Lund had almost forgotten the plight of the tanning yard slaves. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their hurried leave-taking. They held their breath, pressing their bodies into the shallow cavities between the roundings of the casks. Moments later, a diminutive figure stepped into view, halting abruptly as it noticed the hiding pair. Lund recognized the boy who had received a brutal blow from Moshta but an hour before. His face, now transformed by fear and surprise, still carried traces of the searing pain. Ceridwen pressed a finger to her lips. She hastily passed between them, and, with an alarmed glance at Lund, disappeared from view. He followed suit, stepping round the boy in silence, averting his eyes. The horror exuding from this child, marked by death, made his skin crawl. He could not wait to be free of this yard and the curse who toiled here. A disjointed cry caught his mind in mid-stride. Rather than a perceived thought, the meaning sprang from utter need and despair.
Help me!
He turned abruptly, his eyes fixed on the slave. It was a large-eyed, tow-headed boy that at once reminded him of Brennick. This was the sniveling wretch Lund had been cycles before, when they had dragged him from the vat to be killed in Grail. What was he to do? Their eyes met. Did the boy know who he was? What had Ceridwen told him? His name was known throughout the clearings. Were they all waiting for him to perform some miracle? A response broke from his mind almost against his will.
I will not let them take you.
It was clear that the answer had not been expected, for the wide eyes widened even further. Lund berated himself, while the boy struggled to order his thoughts sufficiently to reply. Yet a plan had already half-formed in his mind, and he knew it was not one he had conceived just then, for he had had ample time to mull over it while scraping away at the hides.
Tonight! He will take us tonight!
Lund strode out into the afternoon light.
Be ready then.
Lund lingered over the loosening of the mats, till the last of the rinsed skins had been staked and the vats drained. Moshta had selected the newcomers for the task, as everyone had expected. Now he motioned the older slaves out with his eyes, and prodded a heavy frame with one foot. He ordered the boys to carry it to the slaughtering shed. The long shadow of the third shed fell across the tanning yard. Struggling against the weight of the frame, the two passed through it and into the narrow passage between the other sheds. They moved as quickly as they could, as though they might still please the man in some pathetic way and avert what was to come. As he sauntered behind them, Moshta loosened the broad-bladed butcher's knife in its sheath. The column of slaves moved off with Lund in the rear. There had been little delay, since all felt the need of rest and a warm meal. When the last of the guards had turned to face away from the yard, he slipped behind one of the lean-tos. His heart pounding in his ears, he sprinted off after the vanished threesome, keeping the structure between him and the marching column. A voice in his racing mind warned that he would be too late, that the deed had been done, and he would confront the monster for nothing. Now that he was committed, however, he would at least prevent the Torque from repeating this atrocity. The place smelled of fresh blood and entrails. The slaughtering crew had left an oil lamp burning, evidently for the convenience of whoever would need to work here at night. Both boys were still alive, though they would not remain so for long as far as he could see. Moshta leaned over them like some demon, his face contorted in malice. The fair-haired boy was tying the other with shaking fingers to the frame they had carried here from the rinsing shed. Stepping out of the shadows, Lund picked the hand axe from one of the low tables. The slight noise made the overseer spin round. He needed but a moment to grasp the situation, but that moment proved his undoing. The whip in his right hand snaked out towards the attacking slave, with all the venom and skill his many cycles of mastery could muster. His mouth rounded in a curse he never had time to utter. The fiend ducked under his lash with impossible fleetness and was upon him snarling and irresistible. Having breached the other's defenses, Lund did not waste the opportunity offered him. He struck the wretch a resounding blow above the left eye. To his immense satisfaction, he heard the dull splintering of bone. Moshta took 2 tottering steps, his mouth agape, his bulging eyes locked in a surprised stare. The next blow almost severed his head. The body slumped down in a heap, one hand still on the hilt of the skinning knife in his belt. Lund stood over it, glaring. For a few moments all was still. The boys had not moved a muscle during the quick altercation. They were looking at him with something akin to worship.
Untie that one.
Lund motioned to the boys still lashed to the frame.
And help me. We need to move the body. Quickly now.
The fair boy leaned over the frame again, struggling with the rawhide knots he had made. An ugly weal encircled his lower abdomen, where the lash had bitten into his flesh earlier that day. Lund stooped to unsheath the knife and handed it to him. He watched grimly as the boy flinched before taking it from his hand. They were all too aware of what its intended purpose had been. They dragged the heavy, lifeless bulk onto the frame and carried it to the soaking shed. Lund sent one boy to wash away the trail of blood left behind with a bucket of water. The other aided him in sliding the body into the empty cask. This they would move to the darkest corner of the shed, after filling it to the brim with tanning liquor. With any luck, the overseer's corpse would go out with the next shipment of hides. Someone would be surprised in a faraway town when the cask was eventually opened. Having doused the lamp and restored order in the slaughtering shed, the 3 sprinted off into the gathering dark after the column of slaves. Before joining with the others as they trudged into the main clearing, Lund instructed the boys to find Ceridwen that very night and tell her all that had happened. She would have to find a place for them to hide, till they could be reassigned safely in a distant location. Only when he lay on the dirt floor of the sleeping shed that night did the realization of the peril he attempted touch his tired mind. Lund woke before the dawn. He rolled over and stared into the semi-darkness. This day would be his last in the clearing. A sharp anticipation slowly crystallized into nervous excitement. Would such a bold plan succeed? The image of the dead overseer tumbled through the maze of thought. How long would it be before the body was discovered? Perhaps he would even share a cart with the sealed-in corpse. Hurrying footsteps broke in on his reverie. It was too early for their normal feeding and summons. He sat up as the doors were flung open. Light and noise flooded into the shed. Torque guards rushed here and there, prodding the slaves with booted feet. A lash whistled through the air. Lund slowly rose to his feet, trying to make sense of the unusual activity. A whip handle was pointed in his direction. There were loud commands and much shouting. The only word he could make out for certain was Grail. Apprehension flooded through him to settle in the pit of his stomach. How could they know about Moshta? Had one of the boys? Again the pointing of the whip, impatiently now. Several others were rising to their feet. Comprehension slowly dawned on them. The shouting guards wanted all the former Grail slaves assembled outside. Lund met the eyes of his fellow sufferers. Had their hour come at last? Almost 3 seasons had passed since their arrival in the clearing, and the threat to tame them had been issued. Would the chief overseer carry out the rest of his promise this day? There was no swaggering, gloating figure awaiting them, though. They were granted a few moments to gulp down their morning meal and summarily ordered to march. Lund, with failing heart, watched the sky paling to his right. They were going north, towards Grail. Even before they reached the outskirts of their familiar tribulation, all the slaves in the column were aware of the rumor. They had been summoned back for a royal hunt. They had seen the last of the clearing. All its pain, concerns, and deprivations were reduced to fading memories. Lund struggled with the finality of this reverse. In a way, he was relieved to escape the possible retribution for the killing of Moshta, and yet he had been hours away from slipping the net of the Torque Masters forever. Ahead lay the thick stone and heavy iron bars of the pits. If the rumor was true, the formidable challenge he had waited for since his first training day had found him at last. The returning rebels were locked in separate cells, as was customary. Several changes had been made since the uprising, however. Heavy chains bound them at night time to staples driven deep into the rock. Keepers patrolled the passages every hour, casting the light from their lanterns into every cage, looking for its occupant. Lund sagged down on the pile of rancid straw in a strange cell. It was slightly larger than his previous one, but had no high barred window to let in the starlight. A torch rested in a wall sconce round a bend somewhere to the right. He sat in the deep shadow, his knees under his chin, the long bars of his cage casting its near indiscernible pattern over his body. 2 paces away stood an earthenware jug with a black loaf perched on top, his evening meal. It meant more to him this night, oddly, than it had before, for he knew what toil and sorrow it had cost the clearing slaves to produce. Ceridwen. How he missed her smile, her unreasonable cheer. Perhaps she was northbound that very moment, hiding in the cask meant for him. Perhaps the carts had stopped in Grail for the night, and she was within a few 100 yards of him right then. He sat staring at the loaf, his stomach churning with hunger. How loath he was to destroy this link between him and the clearing. He reached for it and tore at the hard crust with his teeth. All his world was meaningless misery, all his efforts vain. And there, like the renewed touch of water on a dry river bed, came the echo of hope.
They have moved you.
The old man had endured after all.
Kor, I feared they had discovered you.
For all the joy he felt, Lund could not help noticing the faded strength of will that now accompanied Kor's thoughts.
It matters little if they had or not. I have failed. We are all doomed now, powerless to resist.
The fountain of courage, of steady faith, had turned into bitter despondency. It seemed like the final blow to the young runner. Kor informed him of the gathering of Torque nobles, the festivities in Grail, the impending royal hunt. Little was communicated about the atrocities in the arena that had taken the place of the regular entertainments. The rebels had been summoned back to be consumed in a 5-day extended hunt. With so many runners and hunters involved, chances for disappearing and making an escape increased dramatically. Yet, now that Lund had become a prime target, he would be closely watched, with many of the somewhat inept royals competing to take his head. He was dangerous, and they knew it. There would be some scheme to weaken him before he would be released into the trails.
All our resources have been spent. We have no more stored provisions, no more weapons. If they starve you now, and they probably will, there is nothing I can do to aid you.
What are we to do?
You have good health?
Yes?
Then you must attempt an escape. Tonight.
Lund felt his pulse quicken.
They watch us every hour.
Yes. I will send Brennick. He has your coloring and will take your place. They will not notice your absence till morning.
The freshness in the night air heralded the changing of the seasons. Patches of wispy fog huddled in treetops and on the edges of the scores of miniature forest clearings. Like small gatherings of worshippers, they gathered the light of star and moon to contain it in their clouds of fine silver droplets, a veil of mystic silence. Dead leaves, moist with dew, paved every pathway. Deep shadows beguiled the memories and perceptions of daytime observation, till certainty withdrew from the most discerning mind, and senses reeled with unfamiliar scrutiny. Lund had found his pace within the first hour, and with the unfailing guidance of Kor and the sight of his Vron eyes, was unperturbed by the hazards of nighttime running. The cool breath of the woods slipping over his frame, the gentle glow of starlight, the fearful expectation of his sudden and desperate flight, all these combined to fill him with fierce exhilaration. He was wonderfully alive, on a near impossible mission, reaching once more for the bright promise ever beyond his grasp. Strangely, a part of him argued most vehemently against his present course. He was a coward, it said, a deserter, leaving his people to their fate. It conjured up images of the boy he had helped on the march, the young boys in the tanning yard, of Ceridwen and Brith.
There is a weak place in the barrier, a place I know of. A runner stumbled on it during the uprising.
Yes, I know about it. It was the runner I was almost destroyed for.
The same. I will guide you there by the shortest route.
Lund moved the small voice of dissent to the back of his mind. There was no sense in such arguments. He would run to the ends of the cursed tree world and force his way through the thicket of thorns if it should tear the skin from his body. For Kor, for Ceridwen, Lurin, for Brennick, who had given him this chance, and every child in the clutches of the clearing monsters. He stopped on occasion for a quick drink of water. Perspiration covered his body. The air had become close and heavy, the fog congealing into a murky blanket. He would not have been able to find his way, even as the morning light welled up in the east, without the help of the old man. Many miles lay ahead, and his limbs had lost their initial vigor. He would have to conserve his strength for the long day ahead. Lord Zabrin wore the same seemingly reproachful frown. A streak of dark cloud had painted above the eyes of Horan as they settled in the west. Another night was fast fading to make way for the discomfort of daylight. He turned away from the forest to stare at the massive outer wall of the arena. Sighing in frustration, his thoughts turned to the futile search for the rebel leader. That old man, withstanding his will from the start, had turned his tenure in Grail into the deepest nightmare. It was impossible now to undo the damage done to his reputation and prestige. The first failures among the fighting men, even the death of the hunter Rank, were dwarfed by the near-successful uprising and the ensuing deaths. To crown it all, it had been the lumbering Groth who had met the reinforcements from the north, since his master had been incapacitated. The assault on his person had cast him in the light of being a weakling, unable to deal with the inferior beings under his control. He had noticed the resulting sly looks and ill-disguised mockery of his peers soon after. He had endured it in silence, slowly recovering from the severe physical setback, fuming inwardly at the terrible cost. As he breathed the morning air, he was not sure whether he had regained all of his former potency. Where could the creature be hiding? Was he even in Grail? The priests had not been able to find a trace of him. Only Zabrin himself had felt the diminished threat directly after his feedings, when sense and perception blossomed into potency of a different order. It was then also that he had noticed the previously overlooked danger embodied in the young runner who had slain Rank. The steady pulse of peril had moved south to the clearing in the wake of the rebels. There it had throbbed on the edges of his awareness, till his returning strength had been able to identify it. For the first time, he had appreciated the extraordinary feat of killing a talented hunter like Rank, without the most rudimentary training. Unlike the slaves of the arena, a runner never touched anything resembling a weapon. This youth had repeatedly evaded his pursuers, even struck back when opportunity presented itself. And now he was back in Grail, a hunting challenge well beyond the vast majority of royal hunters. If he was not disabled severely, there could well be another upset in the trails soon. Another disgrace to heap upon the new master of Grail. Zabran put his thoughts to searching the pits for the now familiar trace of this threat. He had fed the night before, and still rode on the peak of unworldly vigor. His distant scrutiny lingered over cell after cell, anticipating the sudden flare of warning a dangerous foe would spark. Here and there, potential lingered like dull embers, though try as he might, not an echo came to him of the potent threat he had but recently identified. Had the slave fallen ill or expired? No. A sudden certainty brought him forward to grip the railing of his balcony. The runner was no longer in the cells. Where? The Lord of Grail closed his eyes. He bowed his head in concentration. As the first rays of sunlight touched the haze of early morning, he located the bright warning in the northwestern wedge. The young slave had not even spent one night in his cell. He was already beyond the reach of the swiftest hunting dogs, pressing towards the old burn that had weakened the lion cycles before. He would make his escape, unless... Zabran glanced to left and right. He was alone. Now he had no choice, and caution could be thrown to the wind. A long moan of satisfaction escaped his throat. Around him the air contracted, while the cold heaving claim paralyzed everything it touched. Slowly, inexorably, he drew substance from the stone, the wooden frames of doorway and shutter, the air itself, and stepped out in power. Light and shadow alike recoiled from his passage. The throb of heavy wings stirred the silvery ash of what had been the balcony into a cloud of obscurity, even as the violated space sought to regain its form in the wake of this perversity. Lund felt his strength failing. The lengthening shadows around him signaled the approaching end of day. He slowed to a walk, looking for a pooling of rainwater among the heavy roots. When he had found one deep and clean enough, he sat down to drink his fill. Image succeeded fleeting image behind his closed lids. The cruel seasons in the clearing had touched him in ways hard to fathom. He had somehow aged, in resolve and the sheer will to survive. He had more purpose to breach the borders of this world than before. The imploring eyes of the tanning yard, the dull expressionless misery of the fields, and the pleading courage of companionship, none of these would he betray, and he had believed that horror was mostly reserved for the prisoners of Grail. Every slave of the Torque deserved his aid.
There is danger behind, moving swiftly.
Lund straightened up, trying to will the heaviness from his limbs. How could they know which route he had taken? It was a small matter, though. The dogs would be able to penetrate the line in pursuit, but their masters would be far behind. The beasts would not venture inside the thickets without goading. The woven screen of thorny shrub was as impossible an obstacle as he remembered. He reached out a hand to thrust it aside as if in a dream, till the sharp pain and dark blood on his fingertips made him draw back in annoyance.
Is this the place?
It is. Half a mile, no more.
Half a mile? Lund could not advance for a dozen yards without being torn to ribbons. A slow despair settled over him. Kor was suddenly distant, preoccupied.
Climb that tree on the verge, just ahead.
Kor?
Lund glanced about him in alarm. There were several trees on the verge, But it was not indecision that made him hesitate. He had picked up an unfamiliar tone in the old man's thoughts. Kor was afraid.
What is it?
They are patrolling the line, and he has come after you, the destroyer. We must hurry.
What destroyer?
Lund's pulse quickened, as it did before a run. Anticipation touched the nape of his neck with cold fingers. He spun round to confront the empty forest.
Quickly now. Choose your tree with care. There, on the left. The branches reach to those of the next tree.
Lund swung himself into the rough embrace of the lower limbs. He worked his way forward till he was suspended over the thicket of thorns. A single slip now would drop him into the waiting claws.
See where they meet?
Yes.
You could slip from one to the other without touching the ground.
The sudden realization brought a welling of fierce hope. If he could cross the line before his pursuers caught up with him, no dog could follow him here, and he had at least a night's march on the hunters. Several times he had to search for alternative routes, or risk a cat-like leap to a lower branch of an adjoining tree. The bark was slippery with the moss of the wet season, and the water still sifting from the sky. Frustration knotted his jaw and made him careless. At each dead end he would shake with it, searching frantically for a different line of advance. All too aware of the passing hours, he reached and lunged with abandon till it seemed but a matter of time before he would fall. And then, when he had almost reached the edge of his tree bridge, and the darkened skeletons of burnt and leafless shapes loomed ahead, the impossible message flashed through his mind.
You have to turn back.
He would have doubted it, rejected the well-discerned meaning as a fabrication of his tired mind, if he had had the time. Yet following, as closely as an echo, came the sweeping rush of air, the sudden throb of wings, and a massive body hurtling past with speed and irresistible power. Lund cringed instinctively, flattened his body against the bark, and wrapped his arms round the branch. Frozen in place, he slowly drew a breath. Somewhere overhead the creature circled. Had he been spotted? He rose up an inch at a time, turning his head to catch a glimpse. There, through the quivering leaves at the top of the tree, the dark shape loomed as it circled once more before beating its way westward. He waited breathlessly.
Turn back, as quickly as you can. The keepers are mere hours away.
The rain had ceased. The heavy hand of evening now lay on everything, till the color drained away to shades of gray. There was no argument to offer against this instruction. No amount of reckless courage could stir him in the direction of escape, for it was there that the horror waited now, somehow aware of him and blocking his exit from the thicket. A strange compulsion took hold of him. What evil could rob him so easily of the resolve that had burned fiercely but a moment before? Had not his overtaxed senses magnified the threat beyond all reason? Carefully, he started working his way upwards.
What are you doing?
I just want to see. I need to see.
He was strangely loath to part the leaves once he had found a perch to his liking. Truth had become a fearful thing, a destroyer of hope, unless... Below him, almost within his grasp, was the world beyond the line. He had doubted its existence, reluctantly conspired with Kor to reach it, and attain the mystical promise of deliverance it offered. A clearing marked the edge of the thicket, rough with scorched stumps from the recent burn. Perched in a dead tree sat the beast, its bull-like head staring in Lund's direction. An overwhelming dread settled upon him like a cloak. He remembered the rasping, drawn-out rush of air, the long, deep-throated growl as it had passed overhead moments before. This was no snarling wolf grown to many times its normal size, nor savage beast to tear and rend out of sheer malice with animal power, but some thing that resented life itself and existed only for destruction. This thing was death and annihilation pressed into armored flesh, endowed with scale and claw, fang and flame. Movement caught his eye. A figure, two figures, had emerged from the young growth at the opposite end of the clearing. The casual way in which they slung down their packs convinced him that they were not aware of the beast. He watched them, fascinated, as they crept closer to it. Something about the man in the lead was disturbingly familiar.
They are Vron.
Thor's excitement spilled into Lund to augment his own. He leaned forward, searching for a way to warn these men who should not be, who could not be real, and never noticed the sudden stirring of the monster in the tree. In a moment it had launched itself from the bough, coming straight at him, the air recoiling from its unnatural form. The branches splintered round his head as the heavy talons tore into the treetop. Lund leaped for safety, surrounded by the taste of death, missed his hold on a lower branch, and crashed through the foliage to the thicket below. His eyes, he should protect his eyes. The wicked, tearing arms let him through with a screech of protest. The impact of the ground knocked the breath from his body. Yet, even as he gaped for air, he forced his way back to the trunk of the broadleaf. He gripped it, trembling, the thicket now a shield between him and instant death. Cor's thought touched him from seemingly far away.
That was someone from outside. Do you believe it now?
How could he doubt it any longer? There was a world beyond the trees. There were Vron who knew not of their plight, who could aid them in their struggle. But between, like the darkest bank of cloud to hide the sun, stood a beast of unmatched potency, a dark threat that could not be overcome. He had seen a similar creature, cycles ago, soon after arriving in Grail to begin his training as a runner, set to help drag the bodies of the 10th day slain into the feeding pits. He had lingered too long in deep places, where the chains were thick as one's arm, and the cage bars reached all the way to the roof. There he had glimpsed the beast, and first made an attempt to measure its power. It had been less than half the size of this monster, but intimidating enough. Then, as now, the fear had been paralyzing, as well as the irrational realization that the horror he beheld had somehow sprung from the chest of one of the Torque Masters.